When Elliot Vane placed the advertisement in the county paper, he used 14 words. He counted them afterward, standing at the kitchen window with the clipped notice in his hand, the morning light falling flat and gray across the floorboards the way it always did in November. 14 words. He had spent 3 evenings composing and discarding longer versions, pages of careful language about his situation, his intentions, his modest means, and in the end he threw all of it away and wrote only what was true and necessary. Widower 41, 2 children, working farm, seeks widow, practical arrangement, mutual respect guaranteed. That was it. No poetry, no promises beyond what he could actually keep. He folded the clipping and set it on the windowsill beneath a small ceramic dish that had belonged to his wife, Clara, and he left it there because he did not know where else to put it. And because throwing it away felt like a kind of ceremony he was not ready to perform. If you have ever stayed through a story like this one all the way to the end, you already know that the practical arrangements are almost never the whole story. Stay with this one. It earns what it asks of you. The farm was called Harrow Cross by no one in particular, only by the deed and by Elliot himself, who had a habit of naming things that others left unnamed. It sat on 43 acres of mixed ground in a valley that caught weather from 3 directions, which meant that when it rained seriously, and when the wind came, it came with conviction. The house was sound. He had made sure of that. 2 winters ago, he had replaced the roof himself, working weekends through October with a neighbor named Preston, who was the kind of man who commented on everything and committed to nothing and was nevertheless reliable when it mattered. The floors inside were dark pine, worn smooth in the paths between rooms. The kitchen was large and practical, with a cast iron stove that Elliot had restored because Clara had always said it was worth saving. He had agreed with her then. He agreed with her still. Clara had been gone 2 years and 4 months when he placed the advertisement, not gone in the way of distance, gone in the permanent way that rearranges every room in a house and every habit in a life without asking permission. She had died of a condition that announced itself late and moved quickly, and Elliot had sat beside her through all of it in a way that left him very still and very quiet for a long time afterward. The children, Thomas and me, were 9 and 6 when it happened. They were 11 and 8 now, and they needed things he could not provide and do everything else at the same time. That was the honest reason for the advertisement, not loneliness, not sentiment. He told himself this with some regularity, and it was true, and it was also only part of the truth, though he would not have been able to say what the rest of it was. The letter came 17 days after the notice ran. It was written on plain paper in a hand that was even and unhurried, with no excess ornamentation, and it said less than he had expected, and more than most of the other 4 responses had managed to say. Her name was Ruth Hadley. She was 37 years old. She had been widowed 3 years prior. She had no children of her own. She had worked as a bookkeeper for 8 years and before that had managed the household accounts and correspondence for an estate in the eastern part of the province. She could cook adequately, she wrote, and she was not afraid of cold weather or physical work, and she had no illusions about what a practical arrangement meant or required. She wrote that she had one condition of her own, which she would explain in person if he was willing to meet. She did not elaborate on this condition in the letter. She simply stated its existence and left it there, the way a person leaves a door slightly open rather than pulling it closed. Elliot read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then he read it a 3rd time. He set it face down on the table, which was something he did not do with the other 4 letters. He wrote back the following morning and named a date 2 weeks out, a Tuesday, which was the day he typically came into town for supplies. He kept his reply as plain as her letter. He said he would meet her at the dining room of the Caldwell Hotel at noon, and that he would be wearing a brown work coat because it was the only coat he owned, and she should know that about him from the beginning. As she arrived before him, he did not expect this. He had imagined arriving first, which would have given him a moment to observe before being observed. And instead, he pushed through the hotel door at 7 minutes to noon and saw a woman already seated at a corner table with a cup of tea and a small leather case beside her chair. And she looked up when the door opened without any particular expression of hope or anxiety. Only the calm assessment of someone who had decided to be honest and was waiting to see whether the other person had made the same decision. She was not what he had pictured. He had pictured someone softer, more approximate. Ruth Hadley was precise. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her hands were folded on the table without fidgeting. She wore a coat the color of winter wheat, and she looked at him the way people look at a ledger they are about to verify. He sat down, he ordered coffee. He said her name as a question, she said yes. He said his. She said she knew. There was a pause while the waitress came and went, and Elliot spent that pause deciding something without being entirely sure what it was. Then he said, "Your letter mentioned a condition." "It did," she said. "I'd hear it now if you're willing." She looked at him steadily. "I won't pretend to be something I'm not," she said. "Not to you, not to your children, not to anyone in town. If that makes the arrangement impossible, it's better to know that today." He did not answer immediately. He looked at his coffee. He thought about what it would mean to live with pretense over a long period which he had some experience with, though not in the way she might have assumed. "That seems like a reasonable condition," he said finally. She nodded once as though confirming something she had already suspected. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. He asked about her work. She answered directly and with detail. She asked about his children's schooling. He answered the same way. He told her plainly about the farm's financial state, which was stable but not generous, and she did not look troubled by this. When the hour was nearly done, she asked him one question he had not anticipated. She asked whether the children knew he had placed the advertisement. "Thomas does," he said. "Me doesn't, not really." "How did Thomas take it?" Elliot set down his cup. He said, "As long as she knows how to fix the fence latch, because you never get it right on the first try." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, something adjacent to one. "Does the fence latch need fixing?" she asked. "It always does," he said. She looked out the window at the gray November street, and he noticed that she did not look uncomfortable with silence the way many people did. She simply inhabited it. He found this notable. He did not say so. She came to Harrow Cross on a Saturday in the first week of December with 2 trunks and a leather satchel and a small potted rosemary plant she had wrapped carefully in burlap for the journey. The wagon that brought her from the station also brought Preston, who had offered to drive without being asked, and who stood in the yard examining the newcomer with the open curiosity of a man who has appointed himself the social record keeper of an entire county. Ruth stepped down from the wagon, looked at the house with the same unhurried assessment she had given Elliot at the hotel, and then noticed the plant in her arms was listing to the right and straightened it. "That's the same face she made when she arrived at the hotel," Elliot said, though he said it only to himself. Preston said to no one in particular, "She brought a plant, that's a good sign. Women who bring plants intend to stay." Ruth glanced at him. "Or they simply like rosemary," she said. Preston considered this. "Also possible," he admitted. Thomas was standing at the porch railing, watching. Me was behind him, half hidden by his shoulder. Elliot introduced them with names and not much else, because he had learned that children generally preferred to arrive at their own conclusions, and that extra words in those moments were usually for the benefit of adults rather than children. Ruth looked at Thomas and said, "Your father mentioned the fence latch." Thomas's expression did not change, but his posture did, in a small way that Elliot recognized as the beginning of respect. She settled into the house without ceremony. This was perhaps the first thing that surprised him. He had expected an adjustment period, the mild awkwardness of someone learning the geography of unfamiliar rooms, And there was some of that, but mostly she moved through the house as though solving a practical problem, noting what worked and what didn't, asking one careful question before doing anything she wasn't certain of. On her second day, she reorganized the kitchen pantry, but she asked him first, standing in the pantry doorway with a pencil and a small notebook, explaining what she thought would improve the arrangement and waiting for his response. He said go ahead, she did. It was better afterward, which he noted without comment but remembered. She set the rosemary plant on the kitchen windowsill, in the same spot where he had placed the newspaper clipping 14 weeks earlier. He did not think this was intentional on her part. He thought it was probably only the best window in the house for light. But he noticed it, and noticing it produced in him a sensation he could not immediately name, something between recognition and discomfort, as if a room that had been left dark for a long time had been entered by someone who simply wanted the window open. The children adjusted at different speeds and in different ways, which was what he had expected. Me warmed first because Me was 6 and 8 and then 9, and she had the child's clean gift of accepting what was present without interrogating its origins. She began appearing in the kitchen while Ruth worked, saying little, occasionally handing her things. And within a month she was sitting at the kitchen table doing her schoolwork while Ruth prepared meals, the two of them quiet together in a way that was its own kind of conversation. Thomas was slower. He was not unkind. He was watchful in the way of someone who has been hurt once and is cataloging evidence before committing to safety. Ruth did not press him. She treated him with the same steady directness she gave everyone, and she did not seem to need him to like her sooner than he was ready to. In January, she found the farm ledger. Not accidentally. Elliot had left it on the table one evening and she had asked whether she might look it over, and he had said yes without thinking much about it, and she had spent an hour with it after the children were in bed while he worked on a harness by the stove. She said nothing until he was nearly done, and then she said, "You're losing $11 a quarter on the Eastern Field lease." "I know," he said. "Have you spoken to the lessee?" "Not recently." "It might be worth speaking to him." She closed the ledger and went to bed. He sat with the harness a while longer. He thought about the fact that 2 years of looking at that same ledger had produced in him nothing but a heavy patience, and she had found the problem in an hour. He was not sure whether to feel relieved or embarrassed, and he settled on something closer to impressed, though he did not say this either. By February, they had established a rhythm, the kind that forms between people who are honest with each other and willing to carry their share without performing either the effort or the sacrifice. She managed the household accounts. She helped Thomas with his reading on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She kept the rosemary alive through the cold on that windowsill where it had no real right to survive, trimming it back precisely every 10 days and rotating it toward the light. He noticed this. He noticed everything she did in the quiet, accretive way of a man who observes more than he says. He had not asked about her first husband. She had not volunteered anything. This was an understood space between them, like a door both parties agreed not to open, and he respected it because he knew what it was to have a closed door in oneself and not to want it opened by someone else's timing. She knew he had loved Clara. He had not said so, but the house said it. The ceramic dish on the windowsill said it. The way he sometimes stood in the kitchen looking at nothing said it. She did not try to correct this. She did not compete with it. She simply lived alongside it with the patience of someone who understood that love already lived in a place, was not love removed from the ledger but love that had already been paid, and that did not make the ledger empty. In March there was a visitor. His name was Gerald Ashworth, and he arrived on a Wednesday in a coat that was too fine for a farm call, driving a buggy that was also too fine, and he had the air of a man who had rehearsed what he intended to say. He asked to speak to Elliot privately, which Elliot allowed, and they stood in the yard while the cold came off the ridge in flat, quiet gusts. Ashworth said he represented the interests of Martin Hadley's estate and that there were questions regarding Mrs. Ruth Hadley's legal position relative to certain financial instruments that her late husband had signed, and that the matter had been pending for some time and was now pressing. Elliot looked at him for a moment. "What kind of questions?" he said, not as an inflection. Ashworth named a number, a debt, large enough to be significant. He said that Mrs. Hadley's departure from her previous arrangement, meaning the estate where she had worked, had complicated the standing of the claim and that certain parties had interests in her whereabouts and circumstances. He said all of this with the smooth vagueness of a man who means more than he says and knows it. Elliot said, "You'll need to speak to her directly." Ashworth looked briefly surprised. "I thought, given the nature of the arrangement—" "She's not a circumstance," Elliot said. "She's a person, speak to her." He walked back inside. Ruth was at the kitchen table when he came in, and the way she looked up told him she had seen Ashworth arrive through the window and had already understood something of what it meant. He sat down across from her. He did not make her ask. "He mentioned a debt," Elliot said, "connected to your husband's estate." She did not look away from him. This, he thought, took a kind of courage. The temptation to look away in that moment would have been considerable. "Yes," she said. "How large?" She told him. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the yard and the bare maple near the window tapped against the glass in a way it always did in March, patient and irregular. He said, "Was this what you intended to tell me in person?" "Before the condition." She set her hands flat on the table. "Partly," she said. "The other part was about the pretending." "Right," he said. "I should have told you about the debt sooner," she said. "I kept thinking there would be a resolution before it became your concern." "It hasn't resolved." She looked at her hands. "I understand if this changes the arrangement." He stood up and went to the stove to check on nothing in particular, the way a man does when he needs a moment to be certain of what he already knows. Then he turned around. "It doesn't change the arrangement," he said. She looked at him. "It changes the scope of it," he said. "That's different." She said nothing for a long moment. "Then you don't have to do this." "I know that. It's a significant amount. I know what you told me." "Elliot." He said her name back at her. Just her name, and then he said, "I'm going to go speak to Ashworth before he drives back down the road." He did. The conversation was brief and not entirely civil, but it was clear, and Ashworth left with the understanding that the matter of Ruth Hadley's debt was no longer something he could use as a lever, because it was no longer only her debt, and that certain other parties would need to reconsider their approach. It cost Elliot more than he had on hand, but less than what the Eastern Field lease renegotiation would eventually recover, which he had not thought about consciously at the time, but which became, in retrospect, one of those small legacies of practical honesty that arranges itself without being arranged. When he came back inside, the house was quiet. The children were still at school. Ruth was standing at the kitchen window with the rosemary plant in her hands, not doing anything to it, just holding it, and she did not turn around when he came in. He sat down at the table and waited. After a while, she put the plant back on the windowsill and turned around, and her face had the particular expression of someone who has been holding a feeling in for a long time and has only just found a safe enough place to set it down. "My husband," she said and stopped. She started again. "Martin was not a bad man, he was a careless one, there is a difference." She sat down. "He made promises he could not keep, not out of malice, only out of a kind of optimism that never once met the available evidence. The debt was his, the legal position was complicated because I had signed a document I was told was a formality. I didn't read it closely enough." She looked at him. "I am a bookkeeper, I know better. That is the thing I find hardest to forgive in myself." Elliot thought about this. "You couldn't have known," he said. "I should have looked." "Yes," he said, "you should have." He said it without softening it because she had not asked to be softened. "And now you know to look, and you have looked at every ledger in this house." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. She looked at the window. The light through it was the pale, uncertain light of early spring, not yet committed to warmth. "May I ask about your wife?" she said, quietly. "You can ask," he said. "Did she know how much you—" She stopped. Chose different words. "Did she know what she was to you?" He sat with this. Outside, a bird moved through the bare branches of the maple. He watched it until it was gone. "I think so," he said. "I hope so. I was not always good at saying it." He looked at his hands on the table. "She used to say I showed things better than I said them. I don't know if that was generous of her or accurate." "Both," Ruth said with a certainty that surprised him. "Both can be true." He looked at her. She was looking at the windowsill at the rosemary, the small plant that had survived the coldest months by being tended to with absolute consistency and no excess fuss. And it occurred to him then, not loudly, not with any great announcement, only the way a thing becomes clear that has been approaching for some time, that he had been watching this woman for 4 months keep every small promise she made, to the children, to the house, to the work, to the truth between them, and that this was not nothing. It was in fact the thing he had most wanted and least allowed himself to name, because naming it felt disloyal to something, and he understood now that it was not disloyal to anything at all. Thomas came home from school that afternoon and went directly to the kitchen, which was where he always went now, without quite admitting that this was because Ruth was usually in the kitchen at that hour. She gave him a piece of bread with butter and did not make a ceremony of it, and he sat at the table and ate and then said without looking up, "Preston says you told off old Ashworth this morning." Ruth glanced at Elliot over Thomas's head. "Elliot said Preston wasn't here," Thomas shrugged. "Preston knows things." Ruth said Preston should find a hobby. Thomas almost smiled. He pressed his mouth together and looked at his bread. But the almost smile was there, unmistakable, and Elliot saw it and looked away so as not to make anything of it, because he knew that with Thomas the surest way to keep a thing was not to call attention to it. Spring came the way it always came to that valley, slowly at first and then all at once, the fields releasing their color in a week as though they had been waiting just out of sight all winter. Elliot planted the north field earlier than usual on Ruth's suggestion, based on a calculation she had made from the previous 3 years of weather patterns she had found in the back of the old ledger. He had looked at those same pages many times and never thought to do anything with them. He planted the field. The yield that fall was the best in 4 years. He told her so in the straightforward way he said most things, standing in the kitchen in the last evening light, and she said she was glad, and then she asked what he was doing with the extra, and he told her he was setting it aside for Thomas's schooling, which he had always meant to do and never had enough clear ground to do before. She nodded as though this was exactly what she would have expected him to say, and he realized that she had come to know him in the way that people know each other after years, not months, and that this knowledge had arrived in him the same way without his quite deciding to allow it. There was an evening in June when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and they were both at the kitchen table. She with the accounts and he with a letter he was composing to a seed company, and the lamp between them was burning low and neither of them moved to adjust it. The work dwindled and then stopped, and they sat in the dim warmth without particular reason to be sitting there except that neither of them had stood up. And the silence between them was not the silence of two strangers enduring proximity, but the silence of two people who have said enough to trust the quiet. He said, "I want to change the arrangement." She looked up. "I want it to be a real one," he said, "not a practical one or not only." He looked at her with the steadiness of a man who has decided, "If you want that." She was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain, processing in the way she processed everything with care and without performance. "I want that," she said. He nodded. She nodded. The lamp between them burned on in its low, warm way, and outside the summer dark was soft and the maple tapped the window once lightly as though registering something. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. He did not say anything else. She turned her hand so that it was no longer beneath his but beside it, and their fingers settled together the way two things settle that have found the arrangement that fits, not dramatically, only correctly. They were married on a Thursday in early September, which was a practical day for a wedding because neither of them had any patience for the elaborate version and Thursday was not busy at the county courthouse. Preston drove them in and made several observations that nobody asked for on the way there and fewer on the way back, having apparently run out of certainties, which was, as Ruth noted quietly to Elliot, probably a record. The children came. Me wore a blue ribbon. Thomas wore his good collar and carried the small bouquet when Ruth asked him to because she said her hands were occupied with the paperwork, which was practical and also not quite the whole reason. And Thomas held it with the solemnity of a boy who was slowly deciding to trust the future. In the kitchen that evening, after a quiet dinner and after the children were in bed, Ruth went to the windowsill and looked at the rosemary, which had been growing with increasing confidence since March and was now full and dark green and fragrant if you touched it. She pinched a small sprig from the end of a branch and held it between her fingers and set it on the sill of the window Clara's ceramic dish had sat on for 2 years before it found its way to the shelf above the door, which was where Elliot had moved it in February, not to erase it, only to put it where it could see the room it had always been part of without standing in the way of what was growing there now. He stood in the kitchen doorway watching her. She had not heard him come in. She was looking out the window at the dark September yard, the same window where he had stood 14 months ago with a folded newspaper clipping and 14 words he had counted and recounted, trying to make honesty small enough to be practical and finding that it could not quite be made so small. She turned around and saw him. He said nothing. He did not need to. He looked at her the way she had told him he showed things better than he said them, and the kitchen was warm and the rosemary was alive on the windowsill and the window held the reflection of the lamp behind them, 2 lights together, and the dark outside was just the dark, ordinary and patient, the kind that gives way to morning.